So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Oscar, this piece of software that I wrote with help from lots of other people around the world. It's an e-commerce framework. I'm going to talk a bit about why it exists and what problem it solves and who it might be useful for, or if bits of it are useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the techniques it uses to try and be flexible with software. And then I'm going to take a step back and talk a bit about some of the hard lessons we've learned and we're working in e-commerce over the last 7 or 8 years, some of the kind of war stories and some of the things that might be applicable to you if you're doing anything e-commerce related or transactional. And then even take a step back a bit further and talk about some of the, actually picking up a bit from the code review talk earlier, talk about some kind of good practices for running large Django projects, which e-commerce projects often are, things that we've learned the hard way generally over the last few years. So it's worth starting a few years ago when I was quite unhappy, I suppose, because we've been doing e-commerce for about 3 or 4 years. In 2010, we've been using PHP. We had our kind of own home-rolled PHP e-commerce framework. It wasn't really very good, but we'd had some success. We'd built some big kind of bookshops for clients around the world. And the bookshops are fairly straightforward. What makes them challenging is they have large volumes of data. So you might have 10 or 20 million products floating around. And that'd gone really well. We had these sites running. We won some more business off the back of that. We started doing all the shops selling MP3s or event tickets and T-shirts and that kind of thing. But as the range of shops that we were trying to build grew, we started to find that the software we'd written had a lot of assumptions baked into it about how things would work, often driven by kind of the book industry and how things are. And so our clients are starting to ask us awkward questions, asking us to implement things that we really struggled to do. So they might ask for specific rules about who can see and do specific things within the site, or especially once you start doing like B2B sites where you're not selling to customers directly, it's kind of internal within a business. Then you enter in a whole world of different rules about how things interact, and when you have sales reps, they complicate everything because they have very special privileges in terms of what they can do, and they can masquerade as our customers and place orders on their behalf, and it's all got quite tricky. And similarly with tax as well. I remember we had a requirement where, because you could pay for an order with a bank card, but also with some internal credits or money, and that meant you only paid tax on half the product. And that was really strange because, our previous e-commerce experience of software always assumed that you either paid tax or didn't. And so trying to bend our software to pay tax on half the product was really difficult. And so it wasn't really a very happy time. And you just knew as you were writing software in those days, you were writing legacy code because you'd started with a kind of a fairly inflexible base. And after kind of 2 years of trying to bend it in various different ways, it becomes unmaintainable. And I've seen that happen several times. It's not really that fun. Okay, so around that time I worked for a company called Tangent. That's an agency in London. And we acquired another agency, another London agency. And they were a Django house. They had lots of Django developers. They had lots of Django projects. And they all joined us in our offices, and we started working with them. And we could see how they were working. We could see the process you could use of Django, where you could start with we could talk to the client, you can find out about their business, and you can build a set of rules, that hopefully capture, how their business works. And I remember being really jealous at the time. I could see what a great kind of flow they had through from requirements to models. And then the models just, with Django become the foundation of everything. The views and forms will build themselves for you after that. And so I really, just to scratch my own itch, I wanted to kind of take some of our and in e-commerce and build it on top of Django. But the problem with that was I'd just become a dad at the time, and we had a small son, and I had the amount of spare time you have goes down to kind of 3% of what it was before. And so I really wanted to kind of hack away and start writing loads of Django code to capture all the to port basically our e-commerce software over, but I couldn't. What I ended up doing was kind of walking around North London with a buggy for ages, having to think about what I wanted to write as opposed to writing it. And I suppose if you take one thing away from this talk, actually having children and being forced not to write code is actually really good for the quality of code you do write, because you have to spend 90% of your time thinking about it and then only 10% of your time writing it. And that worked really well, actually, even though it's kind of frustrating in the short term. Anyway, so after several months of this, of me in the 1 hour I got when my son was asleep, I would hack a bit on Oscar. Eventually, I managed to persuade Tangent to let me work on it a bit in my day job, and so after probably 9 or 10 months, we'd built on top of Django, and I managed to bake in a lot of these kind of, I suppose, not repeat the same mistakes we made previously with our other software. And then we had a few good ideas along the way, which I'll talk about in a second. And so we ended up with this thing called Oscar. And it's on GitHub. We've tried to follow the same trajectory as Django in a sense. It's BSD licensed. We copy like the same structure they use for their docs and all kinds of things. And there's something else I'll talk about a bit later. And it's got quite popular. It's now, I think it's probably the most popular piece of e-commerce software for Python, certainly for Django. And we've been trying to take it a little bit beyond the Python world recently. We've been to some expos and things and spoken to people who previously would have gone straight down the kind of PHP line with Magenta or EasyCart or something like that. And yeah, we've had some success there. It's been encouraging. But what is it? I mean, what is Oscar? So it's really just a Django extension, the same as Haystack or Django REST framework or anything. We can mix it into your Django project. It's an e-commerce framework, so it only cares about e-commerce. It's not trying to be a content management system. It's not trying to be anything other than what you would need to do e-commerce. So it has products and categories and baskets and checkout and order fulfillment and that kind of stuff. But the point of it was that, the reason it was written is because we needed to step back and strip out all the assumptions, or as much as we could, so that Oscar doesn't have any real opinion about how your store should work, how customers interact with it, how they pay for things, how stuff gets shipped, how stuff gets fulfilled. It tries to be agnostic about all of that. So every single bit of Oscar is written with a view of how would someone change this? How would someone come in and either throw this away or customize it or do something different with it? There's nothing in there that we consider kind of sacred and fixed, because you'll always come across a client one day who'll say, oh no, that's not how my shop should work. I mean, we need to change that. Okay. And so, yeah, and it's just it's just a Django extension as well. It doesn't want to own the whole site, if you know what I mean. It's not like it has to run the homepage. Like some CMS software kind of want to be the whole site in themselves, and anything else has to be kind of bolted on top of those. But Oscar, if you've already got an existing kind of site which is doing something, you want to bring in some element of transactional behavior e-commerce, you can just kind of pip install Oscar and add it to your site. And we've got lots of sites at Tangent, or I know there's other sites around the world that use it, where Oscar's just a small part of it. It's actually their site might be a much bigger kind of platform doing all kinds of interesting things, and they've just got one part of it, which is selling something. And so Oscar works that way. Okay, so Oscar ships us some templates. They're fairly basic. They're just a blank canvas, really, for people to use if they want to quickly build their own, their own store. You don't have to use them. They're based on Bootstrap 2.3, but there's a pull request to upgrade them to Bootstrap 3. They're responsive, kind of by default. This is just me shrinking my browser window. And Oscar ships with a dashboard as well, which is nice and extensible. And when you have Oscar extensions or you want to customize it for your particular requirements, it's easy to completely change how the dashboard works, or add your own nodes into it, or make it kind of access control, put access control into it so only certain staff members see certain menus and all that kind of thing. It's quite similar to the Django admin, but we found the Django admin a little bit limiting in it's very much just a kind of CRUD view of all the models, and sometimes the kind of core business object in Oscar is composed of several models all linked together. And so we needed to kind of break out from the Django admin and write our own dashboard, effectively. I've lost my phone connection. Anyway, so people around the world have taken these templates and taken Oscar and built some really beautiful sites. It's really encouraging to look at the stuff that people have built, with the software you've written. Some of these are written by us at Tangent, but a lot of the really nice ones are written elsewhere. So here's just a few examples, a couple of screenshots. Landmark was a big one that we did on the very early days of Oscar. That has kind of 20 or 30 million products. So it's a bit ugly, but it's got some interesting functionality. And these are some other ones. Actually, one of the distinguishing things about Oscar in the big world of e-commerce frameworks outside of just Python is it's been picked up by some quite big names. So there's lots of kind of e-commerce platforms out there that've got thousands and thousands of stores, but they're all kind of small, kind of mom and pop stores that don't do anything desperately interesting. But Oscar's used by Tata Group, which was Landmark that we saw before. It's used by Carlsberg and PepsiCo and Vodafone. And some interesting companies have actually picked it up. So again, it's really nice to see that. One of the interesting sides of my job is actually selling Django and open source to kind of enterprise companies who are deeply suspicious of anything where where it's open source or something like that. So I think that's it's quite interesting, kind of going into those conversations, and it's made Oscar grow up a little bit as well, because we need to bring in a private security, channel, so people can talk to us about security issues if there are any, without it being kind of public. And it's made us grow up a bit more by having to put some of these things in place that kind of large enterprise companies want. Okay, let's move on. So when you talk about software in general, there's certain words or terms that sometimes come up in conversations that kind of make you shudder, make you uncomfortable. One for me for a long time has been soap. Anyone brings up soap, my heart always sinks straight away when we're talking with a client. And then also things like SEO or even JavaScript. But the worst one for me, from working in e-commerce and trying to kind of pitch to clients about why they should use Oscar, is the phrase "out of the box." And it's often used by kind of salespeople who are, trying to suggest to clients that this piece of software does everything they want, out of the box without any configuration at all. And it kind of sounds, if you're non-technical, if you're the kind of e-commerce manager of a firm, it sounds so appealing that this piece of software has got so many features on day one which are available. But as a software engineer, it's never really a good solution in the long term, because if a piece of software has so many things which are just out of the box, then the software authors have already made decisions for you about how your selling experience will work, how your things will come together. And as you go down the line, you'll inevitably have to change those. And that's where you end up in the path I was talking about before, where software becomes slowly unmaintainable when you're working with something which has already made decisions for you. So Oscar isn't that. So Oscar isn't trying to be like an out-of-the-box solution where kind of 4 hours after installing it, your shop's all ready to go. You're always going to need to do some kind of development to tailor Oscar to your particular requirement. So, for instance, it doesn't have any opinion about how taxes will work in your store, because if you're in the States, tax is so different to how it is in the UK or in Europe, where you don't know what tax is at all until someone's entered their shipping address, and then you only pay sales tax if the shipping address is the same as where the company has some kind of office or warehouse. Similarly, about payment, Oscar doesn't know how you want to take payment at all. You might be doing just a simple integration with Stripe or PayPal, or maybe you're doing something quite complicated. We've had sites where you can pay for one order with 10 different payment sources all at once. And the same thing applies to kind of shipping and fulfillment. It's interesting, in this kind of pitch process where you're going up against kind of other frameworks which have got, they claim to have kind of 900 features, which sounds so impressive. And it's difficult. You're talking about Oscar when we kind of say, well, no, we deliberately try and keep it lean so we can mold the software to your business. But there's a thing where Ronald Reagan said once, where if you're kind of explaining, you're losing. And it's kind of true. It's always a difficult challenge when talking to people about why actually doing some developer work will give them better software in the long run, rather than something which kind of seems to have everything they want on day one. Yeah, so as I say, the point of Oscar is that you take it and you mold it to your business. You mold it to how your business should work, as opposed to kind of, here's the e-commerce software, and you have to kind of shoehorn your business into the features that that piece of software gives you. Okay, I haven't laboured that too much. So we're not trying to compete with Shopify, for instance, who, if someone came to me and said, I want to set up a shop, and I've got some stuff in my garage and I want to pay with PayPal, I'd probably say you should use Shopify because it's so much easier and simpler. But as soon as you want to do something non-trivial, you want to do something interesting in terms of design or process, then Oscar might be a good fit for you. So it's kind of, the reason why it exists has kind of evolved a little bit over time, because to start with, it was just to make my own life easier, just to scratch my own itch. And then since we've adopted it at Tangent, we've used it for lots of projects, and it's made us more efficient. And now that it's open source and other people have started using it, its kind of reason for being is to build complicated e-commerce sites, let's say. I think in the world of Python, if you're going to use Python or Django straight away, it's worth having a look at. But in the grander picture of kind of, if you just want to do e-commerce, then Oscar's sweet spot is definitely doing stuff which is kind of non-trivial. And we found this. We went to an e-commerce expo a few weeks ago in London. We spoke to lots of people who were kind of really unhappy with their current platform, often coming from kind of the Magento PHP side. They found that things were really slow, or they found that, after a while it became kind of unmaintainable, and every change they wanted to make got more and more expensive and took more and more time. And they were really unhappy. And Oscar's actually, and Django as well, is quite a compelling story for these kind of people. Because Django's nice to talk about because we can talk about how we can use, Django REST framework or Celery or like Django CMS even. All these things can be brought together into an Oscar project really easily. So the whole ecosystem is a great selling point for us. And in terms of the adoption by other companies, we've seen lots of people use Oscar to build kind of marketplaces where there's a site where they've got lots of different partners from all over the world, and they can upload and manage their catalog. And as a customer, you can come along and or choose a particular partner for you. It might be the partner that's closest geographically to you, or you can just choose the one with the best price. Anyway, so stuff that's actually quite hard to do in other e-commerce frameworks. And similarly, we've seen some kind of startups who are doing something vaguely e-commerce-y pick up Oscar quite a bit. People who are selling training courses or events or anything where there's a transaction involved. Oscar's often a useful tool for them. And also with kind of B2B software where you're not trying to solve the problem of 1 million products, you're trying to solve the problem of 1 million rules and about how everything works and how it all fits together. Okay, so I made a bold claim before that we had some good ideas about and then what went into Oscar's design. So I'm just going to walk through one of them, which I think is one of the more interesting ones. So suppose we wanted to buy this book and we're trying to model this in our Django software. So you've got some kind of product object. I think every e-commerce software is going to have that. And in a simpler world, you'd be able to kind of say, oh, what's the price of this product? And we'll just look it up as an attribute straight off the product model. Something like this, very simple. But we've learned the hard way that this really doesn't work very well, and Oscar models things differently. So what Oscar uses is this thing called a strategy. So for any request, we're going to say, okay, get me the kind of, it's like the pricing strategy for this particular request. So you can make it change per user, you can make it change per IP address, anything in the request you can kind of pivot on. And then using that, we can say, here's a product, and I'll get me all the price and availability information for that particular product and for that particular request. And we can read off that the kind of price, currency, and availability messages and that kind of thing, and ask, is this actually available for this particular person? And that seems quite complicated. But with that kind of structure, where you kind of divorce the kind of product object and its metadata, titles and descriptions and images, and the logic around how much it costs and what currency is it in, and which partner's actually going to fulfill this. Is it going to be Oscar lets you have kind of 10 different fulfillment partners for the same product, and you can choose one at a kind of runtime, maybe the one with the most stock or the best margin or the one that's closest to this person. You can do that dynamically. And so we have this kind of pluggable strategy structure within Oscar, and it gives you enormous flexibility for doing sites. We have some Oscar sites where we'll look at your IP address and we'll work out you're in the States, so we'll show you all your prices in dollars. We'll use these warehouses, which we know serve the US. We don't have to do anything clever like bouncing you to different subdomains or anything. We can do it all just using these strategies. And it also lets you handle the difference in tax regimes where, in Europe you might just pay a simple VAT on top of something, but in the States we have to wait until very late in the process before we even know what your taxes are. Okay, so that's just, I suppose, an example of where, having worked in e-commerce for a long time, we've learned that this is a good structure for how you'd distinguish between kind of products and prices. But let's look a bit more now about this customization idea. I mean, how do you write a Django framework where anything can be changed? Any piece of logic, any template, any URL, any view. Let's have a look at kind of how Oscar does some of these things. So in Django 1.5, it introduced this idea of swappable user models, where you could have a kind of setting, this auth user model, which is an app label and a class name, and Django would dynamically pick up that model when it was trying to do stuff with a user. And Oscar's kind of taken this idea and run with it a long way. So in Oscar, Oscar's a set of apps in Django terminology, and every single app, probably virtually everyone, all the models are declared as abstract, and they have like a completely empty, concrete implementation of them. And Oscar supports this thing where you can effectively fork an app. So if you've got an app called Catalog, which has got a product model in it, you can use your own Catalog app in your project, and you can take Oscar's product model and you can change it. You can add fields to it. You can change the kind of methods and override them and make it do different things. And Oscar internally will use this get model helper from Django itself, which kind of walks through your installed apps and tries to find a match on the app label, and it will use that particular one. And through this technique, we kind of dynamically load every single model, and that lets someone using Oscar kind of change any of Oscar's core models, and it works really nicely. And we've taken this even further, so we've written a kind of extension of this get model helper from Django called get class. And so because some things in Oscar aren't going to be models, we're going to have functionality which like generates an order number or handles what you need to do if someone says, I want to cancel this order. And this does the same thing. You give it a kind of app label, and in this case, you give it a module name and a class name, and it will go and walk through your installed apps and look for a match. And when it finds it, it will use that particular one. And this kind of general technique of forking something and then customizing it actually works really well, and it gives you the ability to kind of change any of the core logic in Oscar. And one of the kind of side effects is we kind of need to write everything as classes, where sometimes it would be more natural to write it as a function. But the nice thing about classes is you can always split them, and if you split all the logic up into quite fine-grained methods within the class, then it makes it easy just to override the tiny bits that you want to change within that particular class. So an example is you sometimes get shops where whenever you write out an order line, it always has to be quantity 1, usually for quirky reasons around maybe the fulfillment system in the back end or something like that. And so how you would do that in Oscar is you would kind of fork the order app within Oscar. And there's a management command to do that for you. You can do all this in about three lines of Python, or 3 commands. So you can fork the order app. You can create a new class, which is the kind of order creator class, and you can just override that one method, which is called like write out line models, and just change it so that it always writes out quantity 1. And so by only writing kind of 8 lines of Python or something, you can reach quite deeply into Oscar and change a core piece. Okay, so let's kind of classes and models. URLs and views are quite interesting as well. So if you look in Django, the recommended way from the docs to include the admin suite is like this, where you include this admin.site.urls, and it's slightly different to how you normally do it. You don't normally include the property of an object, but that works well, and that's actually the way that Oscar tries to do things as well. So actually this is within Django. When you do include that kind of site.urls, you can then, in your admin.py modules within your apps, you can then define your own model admin subclasses, and you can start changing URLs, and you can start changing the way that admin behaves. And so the Django admin effectively just builds a tree of these model admin instances and allows you to kind of change them. Okay, so we've seen that. And so in Oscar, we do the same kind of thing. So we have an application object, as we would call it, where for the URLs you would include the URLs as a property. Seems a bit strange. And then the root kind of application class of Oscar looks a bit like this. Actually, sorry, no, this is an example one for a particular project where Oscar itself and Oscar... Hang on a minute, I'm confusing myself. No, this is my version of the root one from Oscar. I've just trimmed it down so much for the slides that I didn't recognize it. So you have this kind of root application object, and it tries to include all these other application objects from every app in Oscar, and each one will define its own URLs and define which views are hooked up with which particular URL. We use this get class again, so we can dynamically load them. If you only need to change the URLs of one app, you can do it by just defining one class inside your project. And then in this way, using these kind of classes to do your routing in effect by linking view classes with URLs, we can use the same technique we saw before, where you can kind of subclass and just override the little bits you want to. So in this example, this is quite common where you want to change the kind of payment details view of checkout, because every shop needs to do their own payment logic. You can just create your own kind of checkout application class and then change just that attribute which links to the payment details view. And then you can install your own one that does whatever you want. So basically, we follow the same structure as Django's admin. We use classes that form a tree that link URLs to views, and it's relatively easy to throw away entire sections of views if you want to, but also to replace the view classes that are used. And in this way, you can change anything about the URLs or the views that Oscar wants to use. Okay, so let's move on from Oscar now. But to wrap up, its sweet spot is kind of solving difficult e-commerce problems. It's designed for flexibility. It's designed so that anything within it can be customized. And most of the techniques we use are really just drawn from Django itself. Okay, and I'll come back to its future and roadmap in a second. But Let's talk a bit more about just general e-commerce things that we've learnt. So one of the first things that comes to bite you is kind of audits. You've got to get audit right in large e-commerce sites, especially where there's large volumes of data coming from different partners. You're getting data from web services, you're getting it from feed files, that kind of thing. You need to be able to answer all those questions from the client, like why is the price of this product this? Which feed file said that there's only 10 in stock? Why is this out of stock now? You've got to have that information to hand. And so a good rule of thumb is you really want to log almost everything you can about these kind of offline processes, especially about where you're getting data from, when and why prices and stock levels have changed. It's also very useful for debugging, where if you ever do have an issue from that Sentry tells you about, you can jump into kind of log files or Logstash or whatever you're using. The normal kind of rule of thumb for software like Yagni, you ain't going to need it. I think this is one of the rare cases where the opposite applies, and you're probably going to need it is the right kind of acronym. So if you're using something like struct-log or something, it's always worth putting in as much information as possible. So we've started using AWS recently, and suddenly occurred to us that for all our log messages, we now need to start sending our availability zone and which EC2 instance this occurred on. It's a stranger flip of the normal situation. And one thing I quite like is what I call kind of audit models. And this is what Django makes really easy. It's so easy with the ORM to just put together a quick model with a few simple fields and write data out to it. And so these would be just a simple model that represents the import of one file. So it'll tell you kind of when did we download it, when did we start processing it, when did we finish, was there an error message, how many records import from it. It's really easy to do, but so useful. Another useful one is if you're ever interacting with a third-party service, like if you're using PayPal, say PayPal Express, you're going to post some data over to them and get a response. And it's really useful to have a simple model that just captures like the raw data you sent and the raw data you got back and how long it took. So here's an example anyway. So this is one that represents some kind of feed file from a third party. There's quite a lot of code on there, but it's very simple. It's just like a file name, various statuses, and then some kind of audit information about how many records were imported and how long it took. Really quick to throw together. And as you're kind of doing your importing, you can just update these fields as you go. And it lets you build dashboards like this one. This is just a screenshot from one of our sites where it shows I think we get images from kind of zip files from a third party downloaded over FTP, but all quite straightforward. But these simple dashboards that we can expose to the clients give them a really great insight into all the moving parts of a big e-commerce store. I highly recommend kind of using these audit models. And here's one that represents a kind of request response. I think any of the extensions, any of the payment gateway integrations I've ever written or worked with have all got one of these, and they've always been useful. Again, this is just shortened down to fit on a slide, but just capturing the basic information about that request. For the specific payment gateways, you might capture different things like transaction IDs and amounts and response codes and all that kind of thing. And they let you build. You can just use the Django admin even. And you've got a nice dashboard of every interaction you have with a third-party system. And here's another example of one embedded within Oscar's dashboard, showing some payments with a data cache and another payment gateway. It's a nice little digression, actually, when we're talking about third-party transactions. So transactions on a different system to yours, because we often, on the sites that we build, use this wrap the whole request response within Django in a transaction. And this is how you do it as of Django 1.6, I think. You can use this atomic request setting. And that's really useful, especially if you're ever writing out multiple models in the same view or the same kind of request, then this is good. This is a good thing to do. It does incur some overhead, but generally you have to be hitting quite a lot of traffic before it's worth backing out from this and doing things manually. But when you're interacting with a third-party service, you always want that kind of audit to be saved, no matter what happens. You don't really want your audit model to be rolled back just because something broke later down the line. So if we look at a kind of simple view like this, where it's going to say, so this is a bit like Oscar's checkout. So when you submit on Oscar's checkout, the first thing it's going to do is freeze your basket, because if you're going to get redirected away to PayPal or something, then we need to freeze a basket to stop people kind of manipulating the basket while you're still on the payment site. Anyway, so we're going to do a write to the database, and then we're going to do some kind of third-party API call. And if that's successful, then we'll tell all the order models. So it's 3 steps. But we really don't want step 2 to fail. If step 3 failed for some reason, like a database timeout or even just a logical error, we still want the thing in step 2 to save. And you might try and do that a bit like this, just using some dummy objects to try and illustrate. So we save something at the top, we save something at the end, and in the middle, we try and save something where we say, okay, definitely commit this. So we wrap it in this transaction.atomic. But that doesn't actually work at all if you've already got this atomic request setting on. If this third, like the create name equals after failed, what would actually happen is you would save the before and you would save the create, but you wouldn't save the third one. This tricked me for quite a long time, actually. And if you do want to do this, if you do want to be able to have some writes to your database which are in auto commit mode, then you need to have 2 different databases or references to databases in your databases setting in Django. So here, I'm just assuming we've got one set up already, and we're just going to create another one by copying it, flipping the atomic requests setting, and then writing it back into the dictionary. And then if you want to do save an audit model where you want to say, I basically want to break out of the normal atomic requests, you can just use the kind of using syntax with the ORM, and that works really nicely. Okay. So, monitoring. So this has been mentioned in a few talks already, but this is another one where you learn the hard way that you really need good monitoring. We've had instances where one of our partners who sends us prices got all their prices out by a factor of 10, and so everything was kind of 90 whole site. And that's the kind of thing where you want to before you suddenly got 10,000 orders for things and it all gets very messy. So anything to do with kind of moving parts and prices, you want to have excellent monitoring. You want to have alerts, really, if things change by more than a certain percentage. It's all very well kind of monitoring, but you need to watch and like deliberately don't publish prices if they've changed by more than 20%. And this is really an application metric. I think we've got to a point now, just if I move on to the next bit, where whenever you're writing any new code for a particular piece of e-commerce functionality, you always want to have tests, of course, or documentation. But I think one of the things that we've learned is you also want to have metrics for it. Is this feeding data into Ganglia or Moonin or whatever your particular monitoring software is? It's like one of those prerequisites. You merge the pull request. Where are we feeding data in from this particular moving part? Where can we set alerts? And we found a simple way to do that is just to use a management command. It's just a very simple class. And whenever you write a new piece of functionality, if you're interacting with a new or doing metrics are changing, then you can just implement a new kind of method on the kind of command class, the number of orders in the last hour or number of submissions in the last day. And it makes it really easy, really low barrier to actually start plumbing your new functionality into your metric gathering software. And so the ops team can set alerts for it. Okay. Finance. So we've had a few instances where we've built sites and we've spoken to a particular client side business team, and then we've gone live or we've got very close to the end, and suddenly the finance team from our client has got involved, and they've pointed out that they're the ones that actually have to submit their taxes to the IRS or to whoever the tax authorities are, that the way that we're doing things aren't right or aren't legal or something like that. And so then the moral of the story, you want to the finance team or the accountants get involved quite early when you're doing complicated things of money and discounting and internal credit systems. And kind of based on this, we've done a few systems where we've had kind of an internal concept of money within a site. So it might be kind of points or credits. You've seen them lots of times. And so we've built this thing called Django Oscar Accounts, which is we worked with our kind of finance team internally at Tangent. So it's built off the kind of double entry bookkeeping concept from accountancy, where every single transaction kind of writes entries to 2 different ledgers. And this is really useful. We've used this for doing any kind of gift cards or credits, and always make sure your finances are rock solid. You've got a good audit trail, and it's exactly what the finance team need if they ever have to submit their reports. And this is just a simple shot from its dashboard. Okay, so that's a few of the kind of e-commerce-y lessons, kind of monitoring and audit and logging and making sure finance people know about stuff. So let's go a little bit broader in scope now and talk a bit about general large-scale Django projects. I'm just going to touch on a few things which have struck me, I suppose, over the years. So one of the when you start on I suppose what happens with a big Django project over time, one of the common kind of smells that things are going wrong is that the views.py module gets too big. We've seen this lots of times. You know, as soon as you open it, you don't see anything but imports because the first 40 lines are all imports. And this is a subject for a whole other hour-long talk, but there's a couple of things that I think are quite useful. Views.py should always be boring. It should just be routing kind of data from the request over to other things like forms validation, then over to some kind of services for doing business logic, and then it should be catching exceptions and turning those into responses. They should be dull to read. They often aren't, though. They're often, you know, it's easy to succumb to putting validation logic in there while doing way too much business logic. We've all done this. And a nice rule of thumb I find when writing kind of views is to always think, what would I do differently if I was writing a REST interface or web service interface to exactly this bit of functionality? Would I have to like kind of copy and paste bits from inside my views? And that's a kind of nice heuristic that leads you down the line of extracting any kind of logic that isn't to do with just turning HTTP requests into other calls. It forces you to extract them and put them in other places so they're reusable. It's a bit like when you do TDD for a long time. If you get used to writing your tests first and then writing the implementation, you kind of get a sense, a sense of taste for when stuff is testable or not. So if you start writing code where we start writing code and you can feel straight away if you're writing something which would be hard to test, if it's got kind of side effects, if it's doing I/O when it shouldn't be. You know, it's almost like a sense of taste. And I think the same applies with views. And there was an interesting article actually the other day by Tom Christie, the author of the Django REST framework, and his 2 rules of thumb, which are quite nice, are inside of views.py, you should never ever mutate a field of a model. You should never say, you know, product.title equals this. You should never ever call save. And what he's really getting to is you should always encapsulate that kind of logic. Any kind of mutating operation should be written as a method on the model itself. So you would just call like product.update title and pass in the new one. Maybe that's a bit draconian, but that's quite a nice guide, you know, that's pushing you in the direction of extracting all business logic and keeping it in your models, if you like, or if you prefer, you can kind of have a layer of services in front of your models, which is something we see sometimes. It's on his blog, on his company's blog there, if you're interested in seeing more about that. Another thing that we've found quite a lot is this aspect of pollution, of kind of third-party systems that try and inject their own strange practices and weird data structures into your system. So an example would be we had a client where they just wanted to send us their product information, but to do that, it actually came in 3 or 4 different big web service calls where they would send us a megabyte of XML, and we would have to try and extract the title from it somewhere. Then they'd send another megabyte 5 days later, which would have a description and maybe an image link in. And it's tempting to kind of allow your own system to be corrupted by this, by having kind of products on your own system which have got partial or bad data. There's a book by Eric Evans called Domain-Driven Design where he talks about this pattern, and he talks about anti-corruption layers, kind of like quarantine areas for data, trying to firewall off the kind of weirdness that the third parties will try and inject. And this is a good pattern. We've done this several times where we just have a whole different set of models for quarantined and strange data, and we keep our core database models clean. We don't allow them to kind of to be influenced by the way the third parties work or the way the third parties model their things. Another aspect of pollution, I come across this quite a lot. You know, when sometimes you're working in a particular company and you've seen some bad practices and you think, oh yeah, we suck at this. But then whenever I work with like some payment gateways or other people, I suddenly realise that we're actually much better than I thought. I often come up against people who've written an API, and you kind of say, oh, well, how do we integrate with your API? And they send you a DLL file or they send you a jar file and say, oh, this is your API, just use this and it'll all be fine. This is a tricky one. So often we try and persuade them to actually expose it via a web service or HTTP. But when that doesn't happen, then the good thing to do again is to try and sandbox. If you have to run their Java executable or their particular source code within your system, then to try and sandbox it in some way. And things like Docker actually are really good for doing that these days. We had an instance where a partner we had to integrate where they wouldn't tell us about their API. They would only give us PYC files for Python 2.6. and we had to use those. Yeah, that was horrendous. What we should have done, I didn't really realize this at the time, if Docker had existed then we should have run that within a Docker container, because at the moment we're tied to Python 2.6 because we can't upgrade because of these PYC files. Yeah, so again, sandbox and quarantine this stuff. Don't let it corrupt your project. Okay, I think this is more or less my final example. So we've started doing a bit of consulting now on Oscar, and I suppose I've done some freelance. And I always find a bellwether, a litmus test for how good someone's project is in a way, is how easy it is to get set up on day one. How long does it take to go from cloning their repo to actually having like sample data in the database and being able to run the tests and actually do work on it? And the answer is often it takes depressingly long amounts of time to do that. And so a good practice that we've adopted at Tangent, that I always recommend to people, is to have like a make file or a fab file or something where you can build, like destroy and recreate your entire project in one command. So we use a make file. So all you have to do is git clone, then like make project or make install or make something. And it doesn't really matter what it does. It's going to like create virtual M's or run Docker containers or use Vagrant. But as long as it's easy. I saw a quote on Twitter the other day that's saying if you can't like destroy and recreate your entire project in one command, then you've just got a prototype. That's quite funny. So what we often find the reason why it's so hard to get started on other people's projects is migrations. Because when a team works on a project, adding self-migrations, then everyone's kind of database moves along incrementally, and no one ever runs them again from start on a clean database. But when someone new starts and you try and run migrations, you'll find all kinds of dependencies are missing, and things just won't load correctly, and you can even get into a strange situation where things are circular. That's really not a place you want to end up in. So what you should do really is, once you've got this kind of single command for building your project, is put it on continuous integration. So every time someone commits, you should be running all the tests, but you should also be testing that you can build your project again, and all the migrations apply cleanly. There's a couple of examples you can look at. We did this for Oscar itself. In Oscar's Travis file, we run all the tests, but then we try and build all our demo sites. We also try and run all the migrations against different database backends just to make sure they all apply cleanly. And Tangent also have like a boilerplate project. I think it's similar to the kind of cookie cutter project. It's like a templated Django setup. It's quite nice. It has kind of, as soon as you clone it, it's got some simple tests. So you can add it to your kind of CI on day one, and it's got some helpers for PyTest and that kind of thing. But it's also got a nice make file, which will let you build your project in one command. And once you've got these things working on day one and you've got them on continuous integration, then it keeps you on the straight and narrow. It stops you kind of going off on a tangent thinking, oh yeah, we'll set that up in the last few weeks before we go live, but never do. Okay, so I think I've said all I wanted to about large scale, or just fairly large Django projects and that kind of thing. It's worth just wrapping up with a few things about Oscar and what we're trying to do with that and where that's going. So next few weeks we're going to switch it so it's on its own organization on GitHub. We're trying to move it a little bit away from being Tangent's kind of baby to being, again, following Django's footsteps. We're trying to set it free a little bit, make it its own organization, keep all the Oscar stuff in one place. We're going to bring some more people who are heavy committers, heavy contributors, to be on the core team. And we're going to try and run it in that way. Version 0.8 is going to come out very soon. And we're going to go version 1.0 hopefully before Christmas. We just need to do a bit of housekeeping. So we're going to make a commitment, more of a commitment, I suppose, about stability and backwards compatibility and that kind of thing. It's growing up. One of my fellow contributors, Mike, would like to do a Kickstarter at some point to change all of Oscar to just be APIs, and so that actually all the views, all they really do is talk internally to an API to try and make it a bit more mobile friendly. It's just an internal restructuring really, just to make it so that it's super easy for people who want to do like rich kind of client heavy JavaScript applications just to talk to APIs. That's something that's hopefully in the pipeline. And it's also, especially with this move to being on its own organization, we're looking for more people to come and work with us. It's certainly looking for people who want to do front-end design or just design itself, to kind of work on Oscar's core templates. That's something we're really interested in. I think there's the Polish translation of Oscar is about 96% there. I think there's about 100 strings which are translated. We're always keen for anyone. If anyone's looking to just take some baby steps with open source and work on something just to get a feel for what it's like, then Oscar's a good project for you. We have a whole load of issues in GitHub which are labeled low-hanging fruit, which are the easy things for people to get started with. So if you're interested, please have a look and then get in touch. And yeah, I think that's all I have for today. So you can find me and the Oscar project in these places. So thank you. Any questions?
Is your son named Oscar?
He's not actually. The reason it's called Oscar is because I was fairly new to Django. I think I've probably made that clear. But when I started Oscar, and I thought everyone named their Django apps after jazz musicians, so it's named after Oscar Peterson. I then realised a few weeks later that there's only like 3 of us who've done that, but but it's actually quite a good name. It works okay.
Hi, I have a question about multilingual content in the shop. Does Oscar somehow help with this or not? How does it look? Do you know any Oscar sites that are multilingual ones?
Yeah. Okay. So we've generally found that. Although I suppose the reason we don't have so much in core to support multilingual in the same site is the way you want to approach it is a bit different depending on how many languages you want to support. So if you only want to do 3 or 4, you can use something like model translation, which is where it injects fields into your models and you have like title_en and title_de. We've used that for sites we've built for Carlsberg and some other sites which are multilingual. But if you want to support kind of 40 languages, then I think you need to, I have never actually had to do this, but I understand you have to use there's a different approach you should use where you use a translation lookup table and you don't kind of change your core product table. When you want to display the title in Portuguese, you have to kind of go to this other set of models and say, okay, tell me the title for this product with this ID in Portuguese, and it looks it up. And it's a bit more database intensive, more SQL queries. But as I understand it, it's better to actually, for Oscar to be agnostic and let you use one of these libraries like model translation to solve that for you. We do need to do a little bit more work on the dashboard to make it work a bit better when you've got the title needs to be there in kind of 4 different languages. But it gets tricky because the way people will want to use it will be quite different. Like some sites will be fine to say, okay, if we don't have any other language, just fall back to some default, where in other instances people say, well, it can't be published until we have translations in all these 4 languages. So, I don't want to have to go down the path where I would make a decision that doesn't work for the people, if you know what I mean. So as it stands, we're trying to do it so that you can use one of these third-party libraries with Oscar on it to make it work for you. Any more?
Hello. A general question.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I see you as one of very few people in Django community who talks about DDD and Django.
Okay.
How do you find DDD practices in Django? Maybe we all know that this is some kind of 2 separate words. For example, model form tries to stand one leg in rendering and other straight in database. So how do you find separating things in DDD in Django?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting. At Tangent, we have quite a few people who come from a Java background, and they hate model forms or anything which tries to bridge the gap. So it they're like a trade-off, aren't they? They let you do things really quick, but you are kind of blurring the lines between kind of business logic and validation and that kind of thing. I guess I'm personally a bit more of a pragmatist, as in I don't mind. It doesn't really bother me that much, but using these kind of things which blur the lines until you get to a point where it's clearly causing pain. So I'm not dogmatic and say you're not allowed to import models into your views.py, which some people kind of want to do in a Tangent, definitely. But DDD, as I understand it at least, is obviously kind of a set of practices and terminologies about how you separate things. And what I always took out of it was if you get this is what attracted me to Django, if you get your core models right, if you get your data structures right, so that accurately reflect the business. Someone said before in a different talk about how programming is just like modeling the real world in the symbols or something along those lines. And that's the kind of what always jumped out to me from the DDD book is that, you know, if you get those things right, then everything else kind of just is built so naturally. You never have to force anything, because if you've got the structures right, then, you know, the way things interact will be. I've always found that to be elegant. And I suppose that was the thinking behind Oscar. I didn't want to have a kind of set of models that you had to kind of that didn't really reflect the reality, and you had to kind of force the realities of a business into those models. I wanted something where you could, you know, add different fields and change things. One thing we've been talking about for ages with Oscar is this concrete multi-table inheritance thing, and should we allow you to subclass the product model and then do different things? And we've never quite got around to looking into it deep enough yet, but it is something because that would let you do it even further. You know, you could subclass and have a record model and then an MP3 and a track, and, you know, and you could add different fields and have the right validation rules in there. And so, sorry, I'm digressing away from the original question. I suppose I've found Django to be good for doing that kind of thing with DDD. Just having the model structure lets you do a lot of things where you're actually capturing the domain correctly. But you just have to have a kind of, you have to be wary of not letting model forms and some of the things that make Django let you do things quickly, not let them kind of lead you down the wrong path in the long term. You have to know when the day to drop the model forms is and to start doing things with repositories and the kind of things that, the kind of more service-oriented things that DDD preaches. Make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, if there are no more questions, and thanks.
Cheers.